What's good, y'all? It's Brian back with the Tuesday night live stream. It's Tuesday, man. I'm losing track of the days. So on tonight's episode, I'm playing around with a new camera angle. If you don't notice, but I got a lot of stuff that's kind of been bubbling around in my mind. I wanted to do some character issue stuff. I don't really have anything for the news segment, and so I'm gonna see if anything crosses my brain. But it's gonna be mostly. Talking comic books and racism and all the other fun stuff that you guys are accustomed to. So this is Blurting Wild Dad. This is Black Nerd, who's a political nerd, comic book nerd, all the other kind of nerds that you can figure out, media nerd. And this is kind of where I sit down and get a chance to rant about things I love. That's kind of what it goes to. Okay. It's a little bit of groundwork here. Understand, I'm not doing the debate stream thing yet. I really don't want to argue with racists on my live stream. I know that there are cats out there that got a fetish for that stuff, or live streamers that really enjoy that kind of stuff. I don't know if I have the right headspace for it. I think I can do it. It's a matter of if I want to expose myself to that kind of stress. This is not really a reaction stream. I've talked about I thought about doing some reaction content, not necessarily anything I would feel like producing right now. And I have multiple sections. I got multiple angles. I talk politics, I talk comic books, I talk movies, and I talk hip hop. And so tonight's episode, we're going to talk about full contact hip hop, and talk about some differences and nuances regarding the hip hop culture and things like that, especially when it comes to diss tracks and stuff like that. And so that's going to be the first thing we get into. I'm going to talk about why the comparison of Magneto and Professor X to Malcolm and Martin is not a 1-for-1, and I really hate that trope. We're going to have that conversation as well. And it's something I've talked about before, but we're going to revisit that. So first things first, we're going to talk about hip hop as a full contact sport. Okay. And it was kind of brought up by watching a lot of these younger streamers who go back and react to old hip hop, from like 90s, 80s, 90s and stuff, and watching how they process the lyrics and things along those lines. And specifically when a rapper name drops another rapper in an old track, the first thing a lot of these kids do when they're listening, reacting to these older hip hop songs is when a rapper name drops another rapper, they instantly jump to, oh, is he dissing such and such? And I think that's kind of an advent of where we are in hip hop with where for a while we had this really super passive aggressive phase where there was no direct naming anybody, and you just kind of hinted around who you were dissing. And if it was an overt name drop, then it was a diss. Let me tell you something. Back in the day, as rappers used to shout each other out on records all the time. If it was a diss, you could tell it was a diss. And that this new thing where you can't say somebody else's name on record is kind of a new thing in hip hop, where you can't name drop anybody, otherwise it's beef. That's not how it has been. And so, let's get into it. The thing that we need to understand about like diss tracks or whatnot, and this is not by no means an exhaustive deep dive into the history of diss records. I'm planning on doing that episode. This is going to be about a mile wide and about an inch deep. Okay. The thing we need to understand about diss records in hip hop. One, for a long time, it was just friendly competition. And in a lot of senses, it is friendly competition, right? You spit your bars, they spit their bars, you kind of go back and forth or whatnot. There's a lot of beefs that people didn't know that existed, like the entire EPMD and Rakim beef. And they were going back and forth. When the Pac and Biggie thing jumped off, and I'm jumping ahead of my outline, but when the Pac and Biggie thing jumped off, initially, and this is just my perspective, you can jump on here and say I'm wrong on it, but my perspective on the entire Pac and Biggie thing was we're watching two former friends have a falling out. Um, the thing that magnified it was the fact that you got two sociopaths in Diddy and Suge on the other side who have another kind of axe to grind, and they're utilizing this as a proxy war and using Pac and Big as intermediaries in this proxy war. Um, the thing we need to understand in terms of hip hop is back in the days when you had independent labels and stuff like that, you had your major labels and you had your imprints and things along those lines. We're talking crack era black folks, like crack era in the United States. There was not a lot of capital for black folks to start record labels. And so typically the cast that started record labels was more street dudes, right? And so there was always like this backdrop. There was this backdrop of hood shit in the background because that's where the money was. That's who the financiers were. But a lot of times the disses and stuff that was just on record. Now, if it got physical, sometimes it did. But the idea that hip hop beef has always been like this fatal, where people are getting killed, or people are getting shot, or beat up and stuff like that. A lot of times it was just on record. So I'm jumping back into my outline. Okay. Um, Calling somebody out doesn't mean, back in the days didn't inherently mean that it was beef or on side or you're gonna kill them. It was just putting them on notice. Hey, um, I'm spitting my bars, spit your bars. Like I said, a lot of the distortion came around the Pac and Biggie thing, like even the Death Row Ruthless Records thing was kind of the impetus where it sounded like a little bit more violent. But when you start talking to the artists who were kind of involved in it, um, they were just spitting bars. Some of them were taking it more seriously than others. But the era of this passive aggressive hip hop, where as soon as you say somebody's name, it's on, is kind of a new thing. Um, a lot of the escalations that you see, and my outline is kind of jacked up, so I need to jump back a little bit here. Um, the escalations that you would see would be shit that happened in the background, like some one crew is beefing with another crew behind the scenes and stuff like that. And so a lot of these players in the background, and I'm not getting into the name dropping and shit, but a lot of the drug money in the background, that was another layer of beef and another layer of subtext that was there that wasn't always directly in public view. um and so you had that churning, you had multiple layers churning. The artists were always the artists, right? The artists are just competing with one another. But then you had competing interests with these imprints and record labels and hood cats who got money, who are propping up these record labels and stuff, who are propping up these independent record labels and stuff. And that's where people got this impression that rap beef was always kind of this uh you always had this imminent threat of death. Okay. A lot of times the escalations were on the streets, and it was kind of adjacent to what would ever happen, what was ever happening in the streets. um and so, and the reason why I got off on this tangent was um young lady was on TikTok reacting to that Jay-Z Beyonce song that they sampled from Tupac, Bonnie and Clyde. And, she did something where it's like the moment you realize that Jay-Z stole this song from Pac. Now, one, Pac's estate cleared the sample. Like they had to. Like they had to have cleared the sample for Jay to use it. But you go to the comments and you see all this, yeah, and Pac hated Jay and blah blah blah, and he would never allowed it. One, I'm a firm believer, just because of how I've seen cats age and whatnot, and how the Outlaws kind of squashed stuff with Chino XL and things along those lines. Um, I think what happened was Jay ended up getting in Pac's crosshairs because of that track he did with Biggie, which was Brooklyn's Finest, where Biggie shot his bars at Pac. He fired, if Faith had twins, she probably have two Pacs. Get it? Two Pacs. And so Jay just happened to be kind of collateral damage. What I imagine probably would happen if both these dudes would have survived this Puffy and Suge generated mess. Um, if Pac and Biggie survived this, I'm pretty certain that we would have had a collaboration album. You know, I know that the plan was Biggie and Jay doing the commission stuff, and I could see the commission featuring Pac. Like I could see in my mind's eye, this is how it progressed because that's kind of the nature of hip hop beefs. The longest running hip hop beef that I'm currently aware of is still Ja and 50 because there was a lot of hood street politics that went on behind the scenes of that, and a lot of he said kind of stuff that was popping off. But I could see that Biggie and Pac would have eventually squashed it, and we would have seen collaborative albums. This idea that this was anything other than some Suge Puffy generated stuff, in my mind, is kind of a distortion of what happened. But you know, don't have premonition. I don't know this stuff for certain. I'm just saying that's what I would see it as. Okay. This idea that name dropping is instantly a threat signaling is just this new thing. And a lot of it came from, because I'm watching how they reacted with the Kendrick and Drake thing. People like Kendrick just went back to how rappers used to diss each other back in the days where you would say this person's name. If you had beef with them, if you had an issue with them, you would name drop them on the record and call them out directly. Okay. And so since we were so accustomed to this passive aggressive version of hip hop, when Kendrick did it to Drake, when he actually name dropped him, it was shocking. And it was a real escalation. For the longest time, and I'm the first one to admit I'm not a Drake fan. I've never been a Drake fan. I will carry that cross. I will bear that one. But I always listen. I always like when he drops an album. Since my old life, I wanted to be a hip hop reviewer. I always try to give it an impartial listen before I make a determination on whether the album is good or not. If I think it's out, just because the album is good, it doesn't mean that I like it. Does that make sense? So when Kendrick started name dropping and name checking Drake on albums, instantly the hip hop community that hasn't been used to this level of directness in their bars, instantly they're like, oh, this is a real escalation. Really, what it was a return to is how cats used to diss each other back in the day. All right. One of the things I've noticed with these MCs is a lot of these rappers, since social media has collapsed the distance between fans and artists, we start seeing a lot of these artists feeling like they have to embody this life that they present on record. A lot of times, and it's not a secret that a lot of rappers typically take stories of people that are adjacent to them and put themselves in the narrative. You know, for a long time, when you look at rappers like E40, you look at rappers like Scarface, Freddie Fox, or whatnot, these are well-spoken individuals. E40 is an educated man. Like he went to Grambling University, right? A lot of rappers back in the days were college educated dudes. A lot of these rap groups that were in the 90s and stuff, they actually met in college. You know, thinking Daz Effects, I think Lords of the Underground might have linked up in college and stuff. And so there was education there. And so the street stuff was on record, but when they got into the interviews, you're seeing this super articulate person who really is thinking about this as a craft. I think what we're seeing now specifically is a lot of these cats are embodying the lifestyle that the cats on record just used to talk about. And the reason why they feel like they have to do that is the proximity that they are to fans. Social media has collapsed that proximity where there is no longer a gap between artist and fans. The fans expect to see the artist perform all the time. They have to be on all the time. And so what you're seeing more and more is these artists feel like they have to live and embody this person, this character that they've created for the album, and you start seeing all kinds of crazy stuff. And that's where these disc records get super personal. It spirals out of control. Fans end up doing the parasocial behavior thing and take sides in a weird way, where now the fans are actually a threat to the artists that they're mad at. It's crazy work. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we've taken the full contact nature out of hip hop, where it became an egregious violation if you name drop somebody. Okay. I'm skipping through a lot of my outline because I actually want to do a longer piece on this and give this justice. Okay. But fans confuse the access to these artists. They confuse what they're actually seeing. They're not seeing an artist perform. They think they're seeing an artist in their natural environment and how they really be. And these artists have this lifestyle to maintain. And I'll be honest with you, Pac got swept up in that. If you're talking to a lot of, when you watch some of the interviews of the cast that were surrounding this entire Biggie and Pac thing, Pac was an example of a duality of a human being. He is also a trained actor. And so, he ended up getting swept up in the lifestyle that he talked about on records, and he ended up embodying the character. And it didn't turn out good. Even you look at Biggie was talking all this criminal mastermind, this, that, and the third, and mob boss kind of stuff. Biggie was a street kid. Like he was a stick-up kid. He sold, he did time in jail and stuff like that. So there's a layer of authenticity, but then he created the entire Frank White kingpin persona, and that was who he was on record. But he also did have a little bit of that hood shit in him, and that was a real aspect of his character. Pac had a lot of the revolutionary stuff that he got from Mom and the people that he grew up with adjacent, and then the thug life stuff that persona that he kind of crafted for record ended up being something that he personified and embodied. But I don't necessarily think that it was actually 100% who he was. I think it was a persona that he created, and then it just kind of the edges kind of melted away, and he just blended into that persona and ended up embodying that persona that he created for the records. All right. This first part is a little bit more rambly than I expected, but because there's so much I want to say, and if I talk about it, it will dominate my entire live stream. So what I will do is I'm gonna put a pin in this piece and come back to it, and maybe dedicate a full show to let me really nerd out on the hip hop stuff. If you want to know the background I had, I went to school for journalism. Actually, I went to school for construction engineering. Transferred to journalism, minor in sociology, started on that path, and then I dropped out of college with about 2 more classes to take. So I'd pretty much taken the entire battery of sociology and journalism courses to graduate, but I said I needed to work and I dropped out. And so the way I describe it is a journalism major, with a minor in sociology, because that's the path I was on, and a raft of abnormal psychology classes and things along those lines. My intention and goal for a long time was I wanted to become one of the hip hop journalists, and I wanted my stuff in the source before I realized that the source was kind of compromised by Benzino. But that's what my vision was. I wanted to travel the world, interview rappers, talk about the artistic side of hip hop and things like that, and really interview them as artists. And so that's what I was doing in school. I worked in the radio station. We had our own show. I was a DJ in the radio station and things along those lines. So that was the path I was walking. And so I've always been a hip hop nerd, and I've always kept up with aspects of the culture. Now there have been times and seasons where I haven't been as connected, but it is what it is. So saying all that to say this, I have so many, my brain is like firing off so many thoughts about wanting to drill down and rant about hip hop, and history of rap beef and all this other stuff. I need to go back and compose my notes so I can deliver you an entire show about this. Okay. Different lane. We in a different lane now. Um, we're going to talk about imperialism and misaligned consciousness, some stuff from the diaspora. We're going to talk about some diaspora related stuff and talk about one of the things that I'm seeing online and entirely. And for me, it's been a completely online movement. I haven't really met anybody in real life that is super locked into the FBA, ADOS stuff in real life. A lot of this has been this hyper online community of individuals that their entire thing is very xenophobic, and it's narrowly focused on hatred towards immigrants from Black countries. Let's just be honest with you. Okay. And a lot of my ongoing issues in interacting with them, and it's not universal. I don't like using broad brushstrokes. So a lot of these are like generalizations from interactions that I've had with FBA and ADOS folks. Every time I interact with them, talking about some elements of, you know, Black existence in America, it's ahistorical, counterfactual. It has this alternative interpretation of Black history and Black folks in America. And one of the things that I keep encountering is when we're interacting, I constantly have to do almost this. It's almost like a weird sanity check where I have to check to see if this person is actually a Black person I'm interacting with online, first of all, and second of all, making sure that I'm not arguing with somebody that doesn't necessarily that is operating off of a limited framework, if that makes sense. So let me pull up my notes here. Sorry, I'm pulling up my notes so I can give this section justice. All right. So the thing that, and I'll give a little bit of background about what I know about a lot of this ADOS, FBA stuff. And my history, let me fix my camera. My independent history with it, it has to do with a lot of hyper online stuff, like a lot of hyper online behavior. And so when I say I'm not entirely sure the origins, I do kind of have an idea what the origins are based on the research I've done. Like I've got notebooks and notebooks of this stuff. Because one of the things I was doing was when I first, around 2015, I got bit by the bug to get back into like news writing kind of stuff. And I wanted to start an independent journalism site that's where the entire long boxing Black stuff came from. Independent journalism site that covered comic books and politics and the intersections of it. And so I was following a lot of this hyper online right-wing stuff. And so one of the things I had an eye on was following a lot of the right-wing think tanks that were dumping money into online platforms to start pushing a lot of these anti-immigrant narratives. And one of the things that I stumbled across was I found a lot of these right-wing think tanks had connections to, they had funded, and they were doing it within different communities. But the ones that necessarily targeted Black folks was a lot of the FBA, ADOS kind of content. That these conservative think tanks were dumping money to sow anti-immigrant seeds in the Black community. And it was just a matter of following the money, right? Like there were some very specific names that were involved in this. And so that's why I had to pull up my notes on it so I can make sure that I'm being factually accurate. So but my notes are jacking up. So, like I said, it was this hyper online movement of think tank money going into sow a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric in the Black community, and so that's when I started seeing this emergence of these groups. One was was it Foundational Black American Group, and then African Descendants of Slavery. And initially, when you look at it, it sounds like harmless takes. I wouldn't mind those names, um, and if they weren't tied to all of this other shit, like if they weren't tied to all of this other diaspora wars between Black folks. Okay. Um, and so what happens is, and I realize a lot of this stuff started emerging when when you're talking to somebody whose entire frame of reference for history, for Black history in the Americas, comes from the Hidden Colors series or Buck Breaking or anything that Tariq Nasheed was tied into. Um, what you're getting is a hodgepodge of stuff that's actually historically accurate, stuff that is kind of pseudo history, stuff that's completely made up, and things without any kind of sourcing, and it's all mixed together. And so a lot of the stuff that you would see on in these movies was presented as completely verified and factual and stuff like that, but in a lot of cases it's this mix of things. Okay. And so um you take you're not supposed to take the Hidden Color series completely seriously. You take some of it with a grain of salt because there's a layer of embellishment that went along with it. Well, from that same group of people, that's when we start getting African descendants of slavery. And for white folks that are out there watching, I need y'all to understand this may not be something that y'all inherently get. Okay, it's like kind of explaining colorism within Black and Hispanic communities. You're just not you're you're not privy to the conversation. You're not going to understand how colorism um, affects how Black people interact with one another. Okay, so um, but the Hidden Color stuff, it's hard to go back and source a lot of this stuff because a lot of this stuff is just retellings and people aren't necessarily providing sources. Okay, and so it's not history. It's just kind of sometimes it's vibe, sometimes it's actually history, sometimes it's not. And it's hard to mix it up, especially when you're presenting it as entertainment. You're presenting it as kind of infotainment to an audience, where you're manipulating the line between documentary and, um, you know, I guess historical fiction, if you will. Okay. So we're talking about issues within the diaspora. The diaspora. Imperialism is kind of the root fracture across this entire thing. All the countries where you have people of African descent, the imperialism is kind of the uniting thread that ties all of these together. Um, a lot of people are living in lands that either were once occupied or are currently occupied, or they're living in a framework like Black Americans are, where we're living in the country that initially was the one that was oppressing us. That still is. And so you're having different vantage points of Black existence trying to communicate with each other. And so inherently, a Black South African is going to see things differently than a Nigerian. A Nigerian is going to see things differently than a Black American. A Black American is going to see things differently than a Black British person. A Black Brazilian is going to see things different than a Black British person. And when we interact all online, we're taking all these different frameworks and trying to find some common ground, and invariably that's going to lead to conflict. What the African descendants of slavery and FBA movements do is they take these and make these wedge issues where we're going to splinter the conversation, and we're going to shut down any conversation. So that's when you get into name calling. That's where you get into black folks shouting Africans down and things along those lines. Now, saying that to say this, there are some differences in perspective. Specifically when you got your Emmanuel Alcho. I am not great with pronunciations and names, so y'all just gonna have to deal with that piece of it. Where during 2020, Emmanuel and his brother kind of positioned themselves as the experts on Black Americans, and they thought that they were going to go on the speaking tour, and then that speaking tour, on the book tour, they were basically going to explain Black Americans to white folks, and it was supposed to be this weird kumbaya kind of thing where we're all supposed to just come together, and we just need to understand each other. It was embarrassing. And one of the things is, you go back to it, is you're talking about somebody who didn't necessarily 100% grow up in, like, his parents didn't necessarily grow up in America. And so the framework that he's operating off of Black life in America is told from a vantage point of somebody who didn't grow 100%, from parents that didn't 100% grow up in it. And so the way that they're explaining how Black people maneuver through America has this really tinged respectability politics kind of thing going on. You find that in a lot of immigrant communities that are coming, where they don't necessarily 100% understand the mind state or the framework that Black Americans are operating off of. Okay. They may be coming from countries where every seat of power is filled by a Black person. Every decision maker, every lawmaker, every captain of industry, every celebrity. Maybe you're coming from a country where it's mostly Black folks occupying all the main seats. Your vantage point and your view of what Black life is as a minority group is going to be completely shifted, if that makes sense. And so there's this disconnect between Black Americans and immigrants from Africa, and it's hard to explain. What ADOS does and what FBA does is they take that as a wedge issue to try to splinter and sow division between people of African descent, and try to run with this kind of, well, we're embrace this American identity while completely shunning the roots of it. Because here's the thing, I've heard crazy shit from talking to FBA people where we're the true Native Americans. We've heard just stuff that I've heard somebody try to tell me that slavery was just the entire concept of slavery was fiction because there weren't any boats, and all kinds of other crazy stuff that wasn't necessarily tied to any real history. And so I'm trying to toss off the extreme examples of interaction that I've had, if that makes sense. So, but yeah, different colonial timelines produce different survival instincts within a people. Okay. And so if you are a Nigerian of a certain age who was alive during the time of the British monarchy, basically colonizing Nigeria, you're going to have a very different perspective of life versus your grandson or granddaughter who was born post colonialism. And your frame of reference is probably going to be more in line with what a current Black American thinks. Okay. We have to understand a couple of things about how our media presents Black people and the issue, and the agreed upon version of Black people that the media seems to have, that we export around the world. People see that and then they assume that that's really how we all are. And a lot of the media is filtered through a white lens. We rarely get to tell our own stories. And we rarely get to present ourselves as human beings. More times than not, is filtered through some director or some producer or something, making alterations to make it seem more authentic. And then it gets exported around the world. That's what's happened with hip hop a lot. For a long time, A&Rs were determining, they were the tastemakers within hip hop. And they would latch on to whatever was popular, and whatever was popular ended up becoming the baseline for what everybody had to do in order to get signed. And then you get one sound within hip hop. And so a lot of times, these people around the world, when they see media featuring Black people, it is what some white executive thinks Black people are, or thinks how we are. And then when you get Black people who are creatives that are trying to present us as a multifaceted community, typically those things never really get launched, or they don't get adopted by the mainstream who pushes this stuff out there. So that's a whole nother conversation that we can have. Okay. We have to look at the concept of, in America specifically, there are permanent caste systems in place versus a transitory occupation that a lot of African countries experience, where you might have had French here and then they left, but the damage they did is still residual, but they are no longer an occupying force. Okay. And so you got to understand that America has this weird caste system where invariably, and people are going to debate it, people are going to fight it, people are going to argue about it, but the caste system, it exists as this, and it's kind of been historically how it's been with immigrant groups. Okay, whatever immigrant group comes in, when we're talking about the Ellis Island times and things like that. Okay, new immigrant group comes in. Italians come in. We have an influx of Italians. When they first come in, they aren't considered white. They're considered something other than white. Typically, when that happens, that means you have to go live next door to Black people. And so that's why if you go down to a lot of Black cookbooks, soul food cookbooks from down south, Louisiana, Mississippi, and things like that, Italians were forced to live next door to Black people because they weren't considered white. They were still under segregation. And so they were segregated into our communities. And so since we had to live next to each other, we adopted recipes from each other. And that's why in a lot of old Black cookbooks from around the turn of the century, I'm talking about turn of the 19th to 20th century, you're going to find recipes for spaghetti, because we had to live in proximity to each other. The church fish fry, Italians brought their dishes, Black people brought their dishes, and we kind of mismatched there. But then at some point, whether it was need for more resources, need for more labor, Italians were graduated up to the status of white people. It's a slippery slope, man, because for a long time, Jewish people in America weren't considered white. For a long time, Irish people in America weren't considered white. But it turned into this thing where when we need you for capital or resources, or need you for a labor force, now we're going to graduate you up to being white. And once you graduate up to it, now, since you're white and they are not, y'all are different, we need to drive that wedge between them. It's a crazy game, bro, but that's how the American caste system has kind of gotten formed. And so what's happened is migrant groups come in, and the caste system is still informally in place. And so that's where I've seen it with Vivek Ramaswamy or whatever, who kind of ordained himself as the Indian expert on Black people for a while, which was really, really weird. He was speaking with authority during the last campaign cycle, but in the primaries and stuff, he was really trying to speak with authority about what Black people should be doing and what they should know and stuff like that, as a first generation immigrant from India. But he was of the mind that a lot of anti-Black racism was all in our minds, and it was just this thing that we made up and this limitation that we put on ourselves. And then now recently, he's getting the same pushback that he's embracing these same racist people that were been super anti-Black. Well, they're like, well, we don't like you either. And so now he's feeling like he has to splinter off from this conservative party because they on his neck. They're calling him all kinds of slurs and everything. It's a crazy game. But The framework I'm talking about is he came here as an immigrant and got indoctrinated to believe that, you know, well, these black people deserve everything that they get, and all this racism stuff is just a figment of their imagination and stuff. And he embodied that stuff and started parroting that stuff to these audiences. And inherently, he thought that he thought that he had a level above us, like he was a tier above black people, and that's the caste system. That's that American caste system that runs on. Sorry if I'm all over the place. My notes are kind of all over the place. So I apologize if you guys are having a hard time keeping up. And so we're seeing these countries. Everyone has been in, they're in a different proximity. Like specifically, we talk about, and I keep throwing out Nigeria because that's the example that I keep stuck with when I think about recent imperialism. Nigeria is still kind of recently liberated in the grand scheme of things. But when some Nigerians come over to America, they have this inherent view, this inherent negative view of black folks. A lot of it's tied to respectability politics. Some of it's tied to media they consume. Some of it's tied to what they grew up with, and knowing that they were different than us. But the reality is, and this is the crazy part, your average racists don't know the difference. And more times than not, your average racist is the one that's calling the power, And so that's when I start talking to ADOS people who are like, hey, we talk about what's going on with the Somali population in Minnesota. Oh, well, they're getting all the Somalians up out of here. It's like, do you think that the racists out there that are rounding up all these Somalian people, do you think that they're stopping to determine whether they're American or not, whether they're Black American or not? They're not doing that. They just see they just see brown skin and react to that. They're not telling the difference. You're the one that's drawing the line and making this hard line and making the difference. And that's really the crazy part about this whole thing. So we see this very xenophobic manifestation of anti-immigrant sentiment, utilizing Black people as the mouthpieces for it online. And because I'm finding that a lot of these accounts are being boosted, money's coming in to elevate the visibility of some of these accounts to make it seem like they have a much bigger audience than they really do. A lot of people that I talk to have kind of a distorted perception of, one, how Black Americans really are, and two, how prevalent the FBA and ADOS stuff really is. It's not. It's hyper online stuff. But since they are getting their accounts have more visibility, and some of them have figured out, hey, I can monetize this account. If I say enough incendiary anti-immigrant stuff, people are going to respond to it. People responding to it puts money in my pocket. I'm going to say more inflammatory stuff. It enhances the visibility of it, and so it seems like it's a much bigger issue than it actually is. Okay. But the thing about it is, respectability politics is the main driver of this. Like when we're talking about conflict between Black Americans and Black immigrants from other countries, one of the things is a lot of Black Americans, and some of us do still carry that respectability politics thing. And for those that don't know, respectability politics is basically the concept of if you present yourself as less of a victim, then people won't victimize you. If you dress in a suit, then they'll treat you better. If you talk a specific way, then you won't have to deal with racism. Like the problem of racism is upon the person receiving the racism as opposed to the person being racist. You're shifting the blame. And I will always counter with, well, you just need to pull your pants up. You need to pull your pants up and dress appropriately. They were sicking dogs on Black folks who were wearing their church clothes. Didn't help them. Okay. For the person that is a violent racist who intends to do harm to somebody, they don't care how you present yourself. They don't care how you look. They don't care how you talk. It will always be an excuse for how they treat you, but it won't be the reason why they don't mistreat you. I hope that makes sense. Okay. And so I constantly say respectability politics will not save you, because it's the truth. But if you're brand new coming over to this country, what happens is a lot of times you embrace the respectability politics because that seems to be safe. If I present myself as a nice, respectable black person, they won't treat me like these other American blacks who, with their loud music and and was it baggy clothes or how do rags and all the other stuff. They won't treat me the same way. And a lot of them get in for a rude awakening. I've sat down and talked to Sudanese cats that were like, hey, I was wrong. I've talked to a Nigerian gentleman who basically said the same thing. Like, I had a misconception of what you guys were dealing with here. It's different here. And this is coming from somebody who had fully been into that space of respectability politics, and then kind of had an epiphany like, wow, no matter how I present myself, no matter how I dress, no matter how I conduct myself in public, I'm still treated like I am a danger and the enemy in some circles. Okay. Shared identity doesn't always produce a shared consciousness. I could go out and do the 23andMe kind of thing and figure out specifically what area Africa I'm descended from or whatnot. I've done the family tree. I've gotten it almost back to the late 1700s. And then I have to go into slave records. And this is the thing that y'all don't understand. Some of y'all don't really understand what it's like to have your family tree end abruptly, and then all of a sudden you have to dig through plantation records. I'm still not having my head wrapped fully around that. That feels crazy. The fact that the history of my family hard stops at a certain point, and then I got to go through plantation records. And those aren't, and plantation records are basically reviewing livestock records. I don't think people understand how that feels until you actually experience it. But if I was able to trace, specifically my country, my part of origin on the west coast of Africa, and do the lineage all the way back there, you might find black folks that have some of my features and we look alike, which is you could see it. Like if you go through look at facial features of black folks in Africa, you could see people that like, dang, that looks like my boy. I know this person. I've seen this person walking around on the street before. But just because I have a shared origin or a shared ancestry doesn't mean that we always have a shared experience. And I think that ends up creating more tension between black folks and people from the Caribbean and people from Africa and people from black Americans and people from black Brits. That creates more tension than anything else. So here's the thing. And I need to put a bow on this because, again, my mind is rambling on this. I got so many different ideas and so many different things. I almost feel like in order to do justice to these segments, I almost have to make each segment its own show, because I can talk for hours about this stuff, y'all. So shared identity doesn't always produce a shared consciousness. A lot of times the shared consciousness comes from proximity and living amongst each other, experiencing America in the same way. And sometimes that's not even enough, because sometimes you can live under imperialism and form completely different frameworks and operations of survival. That's where respectability politics comes from. Because some people have figured out in their mind the best way for them to survive the boot that's on their neck is, I have to make myself look like a less appealing target to put their boot on my neck. So like I said, there is a rift. My biggest issue is that I feel like and I feel like a lot of times when it comes to like the ADOS and FBA is used as a wedge issue, because initially when I first started seeing the money flow online to elevate these anti-immigrant groups, they're coming from the right wing. The idea was it was a cynical voting strategy. If I can create enough issue in these specific communities as anti-immigrant, we could get them to vote for us if we take a hard anti-immigration stance. That's as plain as it was, folks. And people bought it hook, line, and sinker, and they ended up fomenting and becoming, people created entire identity groups behind it, where they're like, okay, we are African descendants of slaves, we are or African descendants of slavery, we are foundational Black Americans. They created these entire identities around it, and the seeds, the origin of this stuff. And I actually, if you guys want to tune in another week, I can actually go through and pull a lot of my notes that I have on this, so I can actually give you names of some of these think tanks that were involved in some of this shit. It's gross. And as a marketer, I know how this is. I know how well you can manipulate social media to manufacture dissent. And I used to tell people back in the days in 2015, 2016, when Facebook ads were really cheap, with $1 million, I can alter your sense of reality. I can uniquely target you on Facebook and serve you ads and articles to enforce a specific worldview and shift your perspective of the world. And that's what they took advantage of on Twitter. That's why a lot of these FBA stuff and all this other stuff started on Twitter and starting to seep over to other parts of social media. So I'm not saying this is a complete indictment. I don't want to just sit here and crap on people that are locked into this foundational Black American or American descendants of slavery stuff. I don't want to just insult them like they don't have valid points and valid critiques of how Black folks from other countries who immigrate to America treat and perceive Black Americans, because there is a problematic nature with some of this and some of these interactions. And even when you talk to like engaging with South African Twitter, is absolute, like, as a Black person engaging with South American, with South African, I should say, with South African Twitter is maddening, because the level of vitriol is a real thing. And they are really relatively recently still coming to terms with apartheid and the segregation they lived under. And you see some very, very, very weird perspectives of Black folks and how they interact with white folks. This is really kind of weird, but it was so vitriolic and so hateful. It just kind of broke my heart a little bit interacting with some Black South Africans on Twitter. And I actually take a step back and say, this is not real life. This is Twitter. And Twitter people go to say the most incendiary things for reactions. I cannot operate off the framework that this is really how Black South Africans feel about Black Americans. This is made up, make-believe Twitter space. But there is some problematic interactions with, and I would be remiss, I would be lying if I said that there wasn't. But just because at points we're talking past each other, Black Americans and Black immigrants are talking past each other, doesn't necessarily mean that it's got to devolve into the name calling and all the other stuff that I normally see as the standard way of operating with FBA and Black ADOS people. It's just, I don't think that that's necessary. I got more on this. I am absolutely compressing a lot of stuff because I don't want to spend all night talking about this on the stream. All right. So we're taking the idea of, we're talking about the idea of the diaspora, right? We're talking about the idea of the diaspora. And we're going to spin it and talk about comic books here. Okay. And there's going to be some allegories here, but the entire Krakoa era in Marvel And sorry, this is a hard pivot, so just embrace that. The entire Krakoa era in Marvel tried to do a little bit of context about how mutants who grow up in specific environments and in different environments adapt to said environment. Right, cool. Mutants were used as kind of a structural metaphor, but not. I think when we start talking about utilizing them as a racial stand-in, that will require, if you wanted to make mutants in Marvel a one-for-one representation of marginalized people, you have to make sure that only marginalized people are writing the books. And that's never been the history in X-Men. And so, because the only person that's going to have an active understanding of what it actually is to be marginalized in an American society is going to be a marginalized person. And I'm going to narrow it down to talk about Black folks, because that's the marginalized group that I'm that's the one I'm most familiar with, right? That's the only one I'm actually qualified to speak for on behalf of, or with any level of experience with, if that makes sense. I'm not speaking on behalf of Black people. I can talk to my experience as a Black person. The thing that always irritates me, and I've said this a long time ago, the one-for-one Professor X Magneto, where Professor X is Martin Luther King and Magneto is Malcolm X, is one of the most ridiculous things that I've seen in a long time. It's not that clean, because what it takes is a very sterilized version of Martin Luther King and cast him as Professor X, and then also this generalized version of Malcolm X and cast him as Magneto, and that's not really a one-for-one translation. I'm gonna get to that in a little bit. Okay. So in Marvel, they have, during the Krakoa era, we had, and this is going to be a very abbreviated segment because I need to get into the character issues here. In Marvel, we had the Iraqi mutants from Morocco, and we had the Krakoan mutants from Krakoa. Krakoan mutants were earthbound. Iraqi mutants were extraterrestrial. They existed in another plane of existence, but then they ended up terraforming Mars, and that's what they took over, right? When we're talking about two different frameworks of marginalized people, this is what we're talking about here. The Krakoa mutants grew up as fully marginalized people on planet Earth, and fully oppressed people on planet Earth. And so the frameworks they adapted to survive look inherently different than the Iraqi mutants, who grew up in a world where they're constantly fighting hordes of demons. And their focus on survival is, these demons are coming to kill us, and so we have to fight every single day. And so the adaptations that in the social adaptations that they brought in were super individualized. Everybody had to hold their own. You didn't help each other. You either stood your ground or you perished, and that was it. Whereas the Krakoa mutants their survival mechanism was community. Like Morlocks forming communities underground of mutants that couldn't blend in with regular society, right? The X-Men, of course, being super visible, and all the different X teams, each one having a different flavor and different mission. But the idea is collaborative work. And so the X teams, X Factor would work with X Force, X-Men would work with X Factor, and things along those lines. And so there was a real strong collaboration with it. And then you also had mutants that were evil mutants, and evil mutants either could mean these mutants want to rule the earth and supplant humanity as a dominant species, or these mutants wanted to kill other mutants because they were struggling with their own mutant identity and they hated mutants. Like they were basically the Clarence Thomas of mutants. I mean, let's be honest. They're the Clarence Thomas of mutants, right? Like when the Morlock massacre happened, Sabretooth was basically the Uncle Ruckus of mutants, where he killed a bunch of innocent mutants to ingratiate himself to a non-mutant. And because he just likes to kill things. So that's kind of where that went. Okay. So you're talking about mutants on Earth. The Krakoa mutants having to learn how to negotiate and live, had to negotiate the world and live in collaboration with humans, and having to code switch and having to enter human spaces, and if they can, not get killed. Whereas the Iraqi mutants, their biggest concern is, hey, I'm gonna step outside, these demons are gonna kill me, I need to be able to defend myself. And so they won't work, they formed the structure of society, and they were defending themselves collectively but yet independently against these demon hordes. Okay, and so it shows how a same group of people, depending on the environment that they're raised in and the environment they come up with, can manifest different modalities of survival. That's the metaphor there. Same identity, different conditioning, different methods of survival. And the really interesting stories were told when the Krakoa mutants had to interact with the Iraqi mutants and vice versa. All right. I super compressed that story. All right. On to Mojo, because I talked about Mojo last week, and I think I lost a lot of people because they didn't quite know who Mojo was. Okay. So when I'm talking about Mojo from the Marvel Universe, let me put him up on the Summer Jam screen here. When I'm talking about Mojo from the Marvel Universe, I am talking about an X-Men villain who made his debut in 1985, if I'm not mistaken. He is in Long Shot, and now I'm off my notes. He is in Long Shot number 3. And the analogy I made back then was Mojo is Trump. And I still honestly, earnestly believe that Mojo is Trump. Like, he is. His animating force is media attention. Like, that's the thing that gets him up in the morning, is ratings and media attention and all that other stuff. And he's willing to kill people to have good ratings. Like, that's kind of how Mojo rocks, right? He's willing to unalive whoever he needs to unalive in order to maintain his ratings, and that's kind of how he operates. Trump's willing to blow up boats of alleged drug dealers, or probably who may or may not be fishermen, so that he can maintain his power and he can have good reviews. So this is Mojo. All right, let me jump back to the studio. That's our friend Mojo. Okay. And so we're going to go through there. So Mojo isn't like he isn't like just a villain. In Mojo World, he runs all of Mojo World. Okay. And Mojo World is a place where it's dominated by television. Okay. He's called this, he's a species called the spineless one, and he's a media tyrant. And so television ratings give him power. He also has other abilities to warp reality, and he has this toxifying effect on the environment. Like, plants and animal life die when he comes to Earth in his location. Okay. His home realm is the Mojoverse. He's a media tyrant. He's a television producer, and he runs an attention economy. Okay. He first appeared in Long Shot number 3, September 1985, I think. Yep, September 1985. Creators Ann Nocenti and Art Adams. I think they're married, if I'm not mistaken. I'm thinking that it was a husband and wife team that created him. And he is introduced during a period of heavy media satire within Marvel, where they're satiring the media. Okay, what Mojo actually is, he's built a system to enable himself and give himself powers. His powers derived entirely from viewership. When his ratings are down, he has no power. It's kind of an emperor has no clothes kind of scenario. And he's a ruler whose entire authority collapses when he does not have attention. Okay, powers and ability. He has advanced extra-dimensional technology. He can manipulate reality in the Mojoverse via his broadcast infrastructure that he put together. And it's kind of a mix of science and magic and some of his inherent abilities. Okay. His biggest thing is he tends to like to abduct beings from other dimensions to star in his productions. And Yeah, he abducts beings from other things to star in his productions, and typically the danger element that's presented in there is those productions end up being fatal to whoever he kidnaps. He's always he like kidnaps X-Men a lot. Like the X-Men are the main features of it. He's created an entire series called the X Babies, where it's kind of a take on Muppet Babies, except they're children version of the X-Men. And they are one of his highest rated shows. And so we see X Babies a lot in Mojo, in the Mojo comic books. Okay. Narrative framing. He kind of decides who's the villain, who's the hero, who's disposable, who's a background character, and things along those lines. Okay. And he has a mechanical exoskeleton that has weapons on it, but it also has mobility. He's one of the spineless ones. Without that exoskeleton, all he can do is just sit over in the corner. Okay. When we talk about the Mojo verse, it is a reality dominated and controlled completely and totally, holistically by television ratings. Okay. Citizens in there are both the audience and prisoners and slaves. Longshot, the issue Longshot, and I'll probably have to do a character issues on Longshot to explain who he is. Longshot is Mojo's arch nemesis. He's a human being, or he's a synthetic creature that was created by Mojo to star in this television show, and his mutant ability is to affect probability fields. And so the reason why they call him Longshot is he can make impossible things possible. Probably have to put him up on screen so you know who I'm talking about. So hold, please. And Longshot's been a character that's been off and on through Marvel, bro. Like sometimes he's there, sometimes he's not. I know that when they first wrote him, he was in a limited series, and I don't know if they ever intended to keep him. I don't know if they've ever intended to make him a recurring feature, but he pops up here and there. And whenever it's a Mojoverse story, typically you're going to find Longshot around there somewhere. So I'm going to put Longshot on the screen too while we're at it here. But yeah, Longshot is the foil. He's also one of Mojo's highest ratings grabs. Like he generates a lot of ratings, and so a lot of stuff is centered around him. All right. So we're going to put him up on the screen. And I think this is the cover of Longshot 1, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. Yep. Longshot number 1. This is the first issue. And so I'm not doing the character issues on Longshot, but you do need to know it because he is Mojo's Mojo is his Lex Luthor, if you will. Okay. All right. Back to Mojo here. All right. Let me shrink him out a little bit. All right. So violence and humiliation and trauma are broadcast as they're all entertainment for the Mojo verse. And so it's really kind of a cynical take on how we consume media in the United States, if you will. And resistance is framed as content other than rebellion. And the reason why they do that is very clear, because if they treated rebellion as rebellion, then there would be an uprising. And it's not beneficial for Mojo to have all of his audience rise up against him and try to kill him. Okay. So we'll talk about some key story arcs here. Okay. In the first thing, in the Longshot series, where we are establishing Mojo as ruler of the Mojoverse. Okay. And utilizing him as the main villain, Longshot's main nemesis, if you will. I gotta jump back up because I lost my spot. Okay. Like I said, cable TV is a critique of what social media is become, because Mojo in the social media age, buddy. Crazy work. Mojo in the social media age would actually be more powerful. I'm really interested to see if they actually do a Mojo as social media. I need to go back and see if Marvel's done any kind of arcs regarding that, because I do think it's intriguing, since we exist in the attention economy, and a social media post that goes viral can get hundreds of millions of views. We're talking about Mojo becoming omnipotent at that point. Okay. So in the Long Shot series, the 1985 series, introduced Mojo and the Mojoverse, established the core premise of people trapped inside a media machine that they cannot escape, that is trying to actively kill them. And Long Shot is literally the manufactured protagonist. Okay. In the late 80s and some of the X-Men crossovers, Mojo kidnaps X-Men all the time. And it's typically repeatedly for ratings. And introduces the ideas that heroism can be commodified. The hero's journey can be a story that the crowd and Mojoverse really gets behind. Okay. And eventually it still is turned and used as a means of controlling them. And violence becomes content. We're the X-Babies era, often played for satire, but it's still kind of important to talk about. Infantilization of characters for audience appeal, making them cute and adorable, and then killing them in horrific ways. That was part of it. But it was early critique of how we dilute things into franchises, because X-Babies were a spin-off of him kidnapping the X-Men all the time. Okay. And then 2000s, he kind of became this recurring meta villain. There was a time where I fell off X-Men books, and so I do need to go back and do my Googles and my comic book pulls on 2000 era Mojo. But I'm taking my wikis and some of the stuff I've kind of gleaned for my outline, for its word. And then I'm gonna go back and do the research. 2000s, 2010s. Mojo became a commentary on reality television and corporate media, and how cruel an audience can actually be, how bloodthirsty an audience can actually be. And it's a nice metaphor, because if we talk about some of the reality TV show that was around 2000, when that reality show thing really took off and became pretty much the standard model for networks, where they didn't have to pay a cast of people, they didn't have to pay writers, they didn't have to necessarily pay a bunch of directors or anything, and they could just bring people in off the street and make their own content based on that. It really became insidious. And there were some really dark elements of reality TV. When you go back and look at aspects of it, I don't know what people were thinking with some of these reality TV shows. The entire Joe Millionaire thing and a couple of other ones. Cheaters is one of the wildest examples of reality TV that was absolutely destructive. And we saw it as entertainment. Okay. But Mojo was kind of presented as less physical threat and more kind of a cultural rot. And I don't necessarily like that version of Mojo. I like him as this weird omnipotent threat, that's existential threat to the X-Men all the time, where you get sucked into the Mojoverse and he absolutely warps reality around you. Okay. Krakoa era, I remember Mojo resurfacing in Krakoa, but they had so many intersecting villains in the Krakoa era that it was hard to keep track, because you had to deal with Mikhail Rasputin, you had to deal with Mr. Sinister, you had to deal with Orcus, you had to deal with MODOK. I'm naming for those that aren't comic nerds, I'm naming off a lot of faces and people that you've never seen before. As you follow me on the live stream, eventually you're going to see who I'm talking about. Okay. But I don't agree with the fact that, they made Mojo, like, I feel like Mojo needs a redemption arc. I think that Mojo needs to discover social media, and he ends up developing his own version of social media. It may have already happened, but I think if Mojo discovers social media, if I'm Marvel, I see that as a gold mine of a way to reintroduce a villain that required, a lot of times it was really a real threat to the X-Men. I think that's a great way to reintroduce him. Mojo in the social media age, man. And then he finds a way to cross over to our world, man. Okay. But yeah, in the Krakoa era, they kind of introduced that kind of idea that he was becoming more relevant. And it became a commentary on legacy media versus modern day platforms. I think if Mojo discovered social media, it would be on and popping. I think that would be a fantastic redemption arc to introduce Mojo as a real threat. And I know that in the From the Ashes era, he was kind of reintroduced a little bit, but the From the Ashes era is an absolute fucking mess. And the stories there had no staying power. They weren't memorable in any way. Some of them weren't memorable in any way, shape, or form, except outside of what Gail Simone did, and Eve L. Ewing, and a couple of random books from the Ashes era. It was mildly cheeks, like mildly cheeks, and unfortunately, there was a lot of forgettable stuff, and I think Mojo kind of became a victim of that, because I remember him resurfacing in the From the Ashes era, and then they went into what we're dealing with Age of Revelations, which I just want to end. Okay. But the themes behind Mojo: attention is currency, which is a very significant issue now. I say the price of integrity is cheap in the attention economy, and that's what we're up against right now. Suffering as entertainment, that's still a real thing right now. People turn on the news to see there's a specific segment of people that turn on the news to see their specific favorite chosen politician absolutely punish people, and they get a kick out of it. Audiences as accomplices, that's real now. We have enabled the system we currently live under, and a lot of us were accomplice. There's a lot of accomplice kind of behavior where we do a level of enabling of bad actors within our seats of power. Creators are tracked by algorithms. Again, this is real stuff, and power that looks ridiculous but is structurally dominant. I think I'm starting the campaign. Let's make Mojo great again. Let's reintroduce him into the X-Men books, introduce social media, and make him this world-ending existential threat that he was during the 80s and 90s. Okay. He's not terrifying because he's strong. He's terrifying because he is really super familiar to us. Okay. So, and the difference is, when Mojo was created, cable TV was the dominant platform of consumption. Ratings were centralized and gatekeepers were visible. Now platforms are decentralized. You can get 300 million views on Facebook or on YouTube, and people on Facebook have no idea who you are. And so Mojo could really create his own social media app and do real numbers. I'm waiting for that. Marvel, I'm giving you this idea. Throw your boy some kind of thing here. Like, give me a chance to write or brainstorm or fly me out. I'll help you pin this thing. Okay. Everybody's a broadcaster. And so ideally everybody will be susceptible to a new version of the Mojo verse that is central, that is localized on social media. Okay. Anybody could get it. And anybody can, as long as people who have phones, there's always a threat that Mojo can return to try to ruin the X-Men's lives. I want that book. I need a social media era Mojo. And everybody's also the product. We could always start with the story of a young mutant who unwittingly logs onto creates an account on Mojo social media, and the X-Men have to go rescue them because they end up becoming a content creator in the Mojoverse, and they end up putting themselves in danger and the entire planet in danger behind it. I see that story. I think that's gold. I think Marvel needs to write it, and I will write it for you. And we talk about a decentralized Mojoverse, where Mojoverse exists on every device that connects to the internet. That would be so dope. It would be so dope. Okay. So I ask a question: is Mojo evil, or is it just the mirror of who we are? Who really has the power in this scenario, the producers or the viewers? And how does social media alter that power dynamic? At what point do heroes become complicit in the participation of it? What point do the X-Men become complicit in it?
Now I know they have to fight to survive because he's actually trying to kill them, but at some point they can say, okay, we refuse to engage in this any further. Okay. And on a metatextual level, is Mojo actual villain, or are we talking is Mojo a representative or indicative of an entire system that trivializes life and seeks pain and suffering as entertainment? Okay. So I like the concept of I would love to have the opportunity, but Marvel, if you do it, hey, just shout your boy out or whatnot. If you want to take that idea, I think you can absolutely make it a superior Mojo arc that is tied to where Mojo launches his own social media app and it takes off like wildfire, becomes the TikTok of the Marvel universe, and he always has a backdoor into the Marvel universe. We could even get into the government trying to ban Mojo's social media app and him just creating another one. Like, we could get into it. We could really have some interesting conversations there and make it seem like he's even more dangerous now that he has social media access. That would be so dope. Okay. Mojo isn't necessarily a villain because of how he exploits attention. He's the villain because he proves how simple this thing is. You know, Mojo ends up becoming a Trump. Mojo is Jake Paul. So, anyway, that's the character issues about Mojo. I have a lot left on this outline, and I've been talking for a long time. So, what I think I'm going to do, we're about an hour 20 into this thing. I may let me look and see what else I have here, and see if there's some stuff. Oh, so last thing, I love to take any opportunity to geek out on things that I find interesting. And I wanted to talk about. I was kind of scrolling through social media. I'm gonna take Mojo off the screen now. I was talking about social media. I was kind of scrolling through social media, and I like reaction channels on YouTube. I really do. Like, I'm kind of addicted to them. And one of my favorite reactions is seeing people react to the best scenes that Bane had in The Dark Knight Rises. And I'm kind of freestyling. I'm off my notes on this one. Um, when I'm talking about comic book villains in movies I've seen, Bane is probably one of my favorite. And I know The Dark Knight Rises has some narrative issues, but he's probably my favorite villain just because he's absolutely dropping bars. Like, he's dropping bars. Like, Batman's not ready for the bars that Bane was hitting him with. Um, and the Nolan verse wasn't ready for the kind of bars that Bane had, bro. You know, entire "Do you feel in charge?" That's a bar, bro. And gently putting his hand on the shoulder, deliver it, man. That is like you feel in charge. The entire speech where he's beating up Batman, and he's talking about being born in the darkness and molded by it. So the reason why I enjoy Bane as a villain, and I think he's kind of done right, is he was presented kind of as this super existential threat to Batman without, like, he did it in a grassroots kind of way, if that makes sense. Took over his company, took over his resources, and kind of did it in this weird grassroots way where he didn't rely on all these other resources. It's kind of the same way the Joker did, but in a different way. Where Joker used chaos to generate his outcomes, Bane was really an ordered villain. He planned. He was super meticulous. And you saw the planning thing of it. And I'm not saying Joker didn't plan, because when you see it, you could see that his plans were actually coming together. And some of his plans were kind of outlandish. Like, it required some Ruth Goldberg kind of mechanics for some of the Joker's plans to be executed. But I'm not here to cast aspersions on Heath Ledger. Bane was this really ordered threat. Super meticulous, super precise. And you could tell he thought about this in different steps. Like, even the opening scene when you're first introduced to him, you know, He's wondering why you would shoot a man and throw him out of a plane. You know, that entire way that he took over the plane, the entire blood draw thing. This is thinking heads way ahead. And the character of Batman in that movie was really kind of a blunt instrument. He didn't really have a plan. Even the final in the final part of it, Batman's plan was, okay, so we're going to free all these police who have been starving, and we're going to just turn them loose, and they're all going to run in a straight line at these tanks, and they're going to fight the villains who have guns, and then I'm going to go fist fight Bane. And that was his plan. I'm going to make everything go sideways, and then I'm going to get my fade with Bane. That was Batman's plan. And it just all happened to work out, which was really interesting. And it's really kind of an interesting take on Batman as this blunt object kind of thing, where in the comic books, he's always presented as the calculating, planning several steps ahead kind of guy. And in the Nolan films, he's just kind of a himbo, a super violent himbo who has a bad case of laryngitis. So I like the way that they framed Bane in that movie. I like the way that he delivered his lines. I know people make fun of his voice. I enjoyed the voice. I think it comes from it kind of makes it kind of a mysterious thing, a hypothetical country that doesn't necessarily exist. I'm not sure I was a huge fan of the Talia al Ghul. I think we kind of jobbed Bane out by just, okay, so how are we going to get rid of Bane? All right, we're just going to shoot him. All right, well, now he's done. And now we got to deal with Talia al Ghul. I think he was a more compelling villain. I would almost rather Talia al Ghul had her own movie, if that makes sense. I understand, utilizing Bane as kind of her dragging her cat's paw to go mess with Batman in strange ways. But I almost feel like the force that he was on the screen, how much of a force he was, I almost feel like it was betrayed by how they took him out. Because he was the most compelling part of that movie. He was the most interesting character in that movie by far. Nobody else is more interesting than Bane. Maybe Alfred. I don't even think Alfred was that interesting compared to Bane. I think Bane was overwhelmingly way more interesting than Bruce, way more interesting than Talia al Ghul. I think that they kind of played us with the ending and how they got out. And I know that they had to rewrite it because the Dark Knight Rises is really supposed to be the trial of the Joker. And with Heath Ledger's passing, they had to rewrite the entire movie from scratch. Okay. But Bane turning the city upside down, the kangaroo court, all that stuff was really, really brilliant. And I almost feel like it kind of reduced him to just hired muscle as opposed to a strategic planner like he is in the comic books. Because Bane in the comic books is the absolute menace and threat. He's almost every bit as smart as Batman. And he has all the physical advantages, but he also is a super cerebral guy. Like when Bane first appeared in Nightfall, where he broke Batman's back, he planned. He exhausted Batman by releasing all the rogues and making him go on a marathon, catching all of them, and broke into Wayne Manor and broke his back. That is somebody who's thinking 7 steps ahead. I wish that they would have allowed that to happen in the movie a little bit more and gave him a little bit more of an ending than Catwoman shoots him with cannons from a bike. Because like I said, it just felt anticlimactic. That entire last fight was just kind of an anticlimactic thing that just kind of happened and then it was over with. So anyway, y'all, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this thing up. I hope y'all have a happy new year. I'm going to sit back and look at this show because I got off of I'll be honest with you, my notes got jumbled. And so I was kind of freestyling a lot of stuff. And so a lot of stuff didn't come out the right way. I didn't necessarily give it what I wanted to. The interaction between, I'm going to actually go through my notes and pull up the stuff I actually have, the notes I actually have from the foundation of the foundational Black Americans, African descendants of slavery, and talk about the connections that the think tanks that have been propping them up and stuff, and show you some of where the money goes and where the money came from and stuff. Like I did a little bit more research on it than I actually let on. And so, again, it is what it is. They all can't be amazing. But anyway, I will hit you guys later. I'll talk to you later.